The cranial nerves are a set of 12 nerves which arise from the brain rather than the spinal cord, innervating and receiving information from structures of the body via separate foramen in the skull. With the help of a few familiar faces, we would like to show you where these nerves originate, where they pass through the skull, and the structures that they're connected to. Without further ado, let's begin with cranial nerve number 1.
Hello, I'm Stefan Breuer, lecturer in the biochemistry course. Some of you may know me. And I think today I'm the olfactory nerve, the first cranial nerve.
The olfactory nerve is a purely sensory nerve, carrying olfactory signals from receptors in the nasal mucosa, which synapse onto fibers of the nerve. They then pass through the cribriform plates, forming 2 olfactory bulbs, which then follow the olfactory tract, projecting straight to the olfactory cortex in the temporal lobe.
Hi, I'm Julie, and cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve.
The optic nerve is purely sensory. It carries visual signals from the receptors in the retina, which converge into the optic nerve. The optic nerves travel through the optic canal, cross at the optic chiasm, then synapse in the lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus. From here, they project to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe.
Hi, I'm Rafe, and cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve.
The oculomotor nerve is a pure motor nerve, originating from the oculomotor and Edinger-Westphal nuclei in the midbrain. It exits the cranium via the superior orbital fissure and enters the eye posteriorly. The oculomotor nerve innervates the superior, medial, and inferior rectus and the inferior oblique. It is also involved in autonomic contraction of the pupillary sphincter.
Hi, I'm Susan Howard. I'm introducing the cranial nerve number 4, the trochlear nerve.
The trochlear nerve is a pure motor nerve. It originates in the trochlear nucleus of the midbrain and exits the cranium through the superior orbital fissure. It enters the eye posteriorly to innervate the superior oblique muscle, which abducts and internally rotates the eye.
Hi, I'm Polly C, and cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal.
The trigeminal nerve is a mixed nerve. It carries touch, pressure, and pain sensory stimuli from the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular areas. The ophthalmic branch enters the cranium via the superior orbital fissure, the maxillary branch enters the cranium via the foramen rotundum, and the mandibular branch enters the cranium via the foramen ovale. The 3 branches converge at the pons and go to the trigeminal nuclei in the brainstem. The motor portion of the mandibular branch originates in the motor aspect of the nuclei and enters the cranium via the foramen ovale. This then innervates the muscles of mastication and the tensor tympani of the middle ear.
I'm Andras. Cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens nerve, or nervus abducens.
The abducens nerve is a pure motor nerve. It originates in the pontine nucleus of the brainstem and exits the cranium through the superior orbital fissure. It enters the eye posteriorly to innervate the lateral rectus muscle that abducts the eye.
G'day, this is Rich Callahan, introducing the 7th or facial cranial nerve.
The facial nerve is a mixed nerve. It carries taste information from the tongue through the internal acoustic meatus to the solitary nucleus. Sensory information on touch and pressure from the back of the ear also travel through the internal acoustic meatus, then terminate in the trigeminal nucleus. The somatic motor branches of this nerve originate in the facial nerve motor nucleus, exiting the skull through the internal acoustic meatus. The somatic motor branch then split to serve the muscles that control facial expression and the acoustic reflex of the inner ear. The autonomic motor output from the superior salivary nucleus affects the lacrimal gland to produce tears and the submandibular gland to produce saliva.
Hi, I'm Ben Corrie, and the 8th cranial nerve is the vestibulocochlear.
The vestibulocochlear nerve is a pure sensory nerve, carrying signals for hearing from the hair cells of the cochlea in the inner ear for auditory information, and the hair cells of the semicircular canals, ultricle and saccule of the inner ear for equilibrium and balance information. These 2 branches then merge to become vestibulocochlear nerve and enter the cranium via the internal acoustic meatus. From here it goes to the vestibular and cochlear nuclei.
You can't hear a word that John Beckers is saying right now because he's a gentle lad. He's trying to tell you that cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal.
The glossopharyngeal nerve is a mixed nerve. Its sensory function has both somatic and autonomic functions. The somatic function controls taste at the back of the tongue, while the autonomic function controls the carotid body's sensing of oxygen levels. Receptors from these areas enter the cranium through the jugular foramen and go to the trigeminal and solitary nuclei of the brainstem. The motor nerve originates in the salivary nucleus of the brainstem and exits the cranium through the jugular foramen. This nerve then travels to the pharynx and larynx muscles for swallowing and the parotid salivary gland for secretion.
Hello, I'm Mark Ellison, and cranial nerve 10 is the vagus.
The vagus nerve is a mixed nerve. Autonomic sensory stimuli from the abdominal organs, as well as somatic sensory stimuli from the ear, pharynx, and larynx enter the skull through the jugular foramen to the solitary and trigeminal nuclei. The motor branch of this nerve originates in the dorsal nucleus for autonomic and nucleus ambiguous for somatic, exiting the skull through the jugular foramen to service the smooth muscle innervation of abdominal viscera and has somatic control of the pharynx and larynx.
Hello, I'm Ward Clara, and cranial nerve number 11 is the accessory nerve, and I think it helps me shrug my shoulders.
The accessory nerve is a pure motor nerve. The spinal root of the accessory nerve originates in the spinal cord and enters the skull through the foramen magnum. The cranial root originates in the medulla before uniting with the spinal component, before passing through the jugular foramen. It then goes on to innervate the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscles for neck and shoulder movement, as well as the muscle innervation of the swallowing muscles.
Hi, I'm Brian Schmidt, and the cranial nerve number 12 is the hypoglossal.
The hypoglossal nerve is a pure motor nerve. It originates in the hypoglossal nucleus in the brainstem and exits the cranium through the hypoglossal canal. From here, it travels to the intrinsic and extrinsic tongue muscles to move the tongue.
And with that, we conclude the overview to the cranial nerves. We'd like to thank the ANU staff who so graciously helped us introduce each nerve. It made an excellent addition to the video. Thanks for watching.
No!